I'm Riley Lackey, and this is my final project. So just some background information. I was placed in Morgan Mill ISD. I was working with 6th and 8th grade math, and then I also worked in a 6th grade world geography classroom, and the teacher that I observed was Jaden Reynolds, and he's also a coach for Morgan Mill. The first picture is of the school, and the second picture is of their mascot, and they are the Mustangs. So was there collaborative planning? Yes and no. The only collaborative planning I ever saw him was working with teachers with activities that they could use in their math lessons in other grades, but that was really the only planning he did with other teachers. He does teach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math, and he's the only teacher that teaches 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math, and he's also the only teacher that teaches 6th grade world geography, so he does a lot of planning by himself, so I did not see him work with a lot of other teachers. So what were the TEKs and were the TEKs unpacked? So the TEKs were math TEKs, and then also occasionally I was in the world geography class, so there were world geography TEKs. Most of the time, the TEKs were not unpacked. He would just teach what needed to be taught, and that was it. I think it'd be beneficial if he wrote down the TEKs, whether it be on this whiteboard, which is one of the whiteboards in his class of the picture that I included, or later on you'll see his grades are divided. He has 4 grades or 4 classes, so his classes are divided, and he can write down, he has the objective in the grade, he could write down the TEK as well as like a focus and guiding question as well in each one of those, or he can just use this one board for all of that. So the TEKs weren't really unpacked. Were the design activities appropriate for the lesson? Yes and no. So the only things that really were appropriate were when they used IXL. He was trying to see if they knew what he had taught that day. That's the only thing that I think was really, like, activity-wise that was appropriate. The only other activity he did was just go ahead and give them their homework. I think instead of just giving their homework that he could have gave them, like, a worksheet or a fun activity to work as a group, to have something fun to do, or maybe work in pairs. Like, maybe do kind of like a mystery, like, math game where they try to figure out who the culprit was, or do a fun color by number with whatever they were learning, just something fun, or instead of just going right into their math homework. So opening and closing activities, were they discussed? So yes and no. The only times they were discussed were when he was like, okay, like this is what we're going to do today, so I need you to get these things out. When they weren't, he would just say, okay, you're going to sit at your desk and wait till I start. Like, that was it. The other activities would be like, hey, we're going to work on IXL before we start as a warm-up. Like, he didn't really have warm-ups for them to do. They either did, like, a warm-up in IXL, or they just jumped right into their lesson. So was the purpose of the lessons established? Yes and no. So there were times where students would understand what they were learning, and then there were times where they wouldn't understand. And so the times you would know, like, the purpose of the lesson was fully taught was if when they were working on their homework, most of the students came up and asked questions. And it was really like over the same types of questions, so he would have to go and basically reteach what he just taught with the class. And then the times where it was established was when they would do their homework and no one would have questions, or whenever they would be working with the whiteboards and they would be working out problems and they would be getting them right, and he would say, yes, that's correct. That was the only times when the purpose of the lesson was established. So were students engaged in lessons? The only times I ever saw the students engaged in lessons were when they used the whiteboards to write out a step-by-step problem, or solve a certain step in the problem, or solve for a missing angle. Like, those were the only times that they were engaged. When they weren't engaged, it was really just when they were taking notes. That was really it. Like, they wouldn't be paying attention. They would kind of just be off doing their own thing. And so when they were taking notes from the workbook or just reading from their workbook, they would not be engaged at all. They'd be messing around, messing with pencils, sharpeners, you name it. They wouldn't be engaged if it wasn't taught in like a fun way rather than just being taught out of the workbook. So content and or language objectives used. So yes, he definitely used language, a lot of vocabulary in his lessons. That was his major thing, was going over the vocabulary. He would use other vocabulary terms to solve new vocabulary terms and things like that. So the students really did know their vocabulary with him. There were not guided or focus questions in his lessons. He didn't have that written down. He didn't ask them to read any of that stuff. I think it would be beneficial if he did, even if it was written on a board or even if it was shown on the smart board. Having a guided question and a focus question for his students, I think, would be really beneficial. So were the lessons opened? So there were times where the lessons were open where he would be like, okay, we just learned this. Like for example, when he did expressions and equations, he would be like, we know this part of it, but what do we know about this part? And then he would have the students answer and talk about it. Or if it was like, okay, we know a right angle is 90 degrees. How do we indicate that? Just to jumpstart the lesson, that's how he would open it. But that would be rarely. Most of the times he just jumped right into the lesson and he didn't really open up the lesson. He would just start reading from the workbook or the textbook. So was checking for understanding evident? Yes, checking for understanding was evident in his classroom. When he was checking for understanding, he would use the whiteboards, have them write a step-by-step problem. That worked really well for his students. He also, if they were working on IXL and he saw a student got a question right, he would have the students explain. He'd be like, hey, I saw you got this question right. Can you explain to me how you got that right? Can you walk me step by step? And that's how he would check to see if they were understanding what they were doing. And even if they got a question wrong, he would also be like, hey, I saw you got this wrong. What'd you do? And then they'd tell him, and then they'd walk it step by step, like they'd walk through it. And so that's how he would check for understanding. He would also check for understanding with their IXL scores, as well as if what they made on their homework. So were the lessons closed? Yes and no. So sometimes he would recap what they learned, go over vocabulary, go over the steps. That's how he would close the lesson. But then there were other times where he was like, okay, that's all I have. Here's your worksheet, or here's your homework. Y'all can start on that. So sometimes the lessons were not closed. So what are assessments that are given? So the only assessment that I ever saw him give was a benchmark, other than just homework assignments. That the biggest assessment that I saw him give was a benchmark. And they compared the benchmark scores from their other benchmark they took to see if they improved. And then how was this utilized in class? So he would take what they missed as a class, like he would look at the most missed questions they missed as a whole, and then he would go over, hey, okay, I saw we missed this question. Why do you think we missed this question? What was hard? What were you struggling with? Like, he would use the data from the assessment and he would use it as a review and go over that. Or sometimes he even used what he missed to know what lessons he needed to reteach or go back over. So that's how it was utilized in class. So were formative and summative assessments evident? The only assessments he ever gave that I saw were a benchmark and then grading his homework worksheets and assignments that he gave out. Those are the only assessments that I know that I saw was evident, and they were rarely used, so they were both used the same while I was in his class. So what was the purpose of the assessment? The benchmark was trying to see what they knew after they took the first one, if they improved or not, and then they would use that data to know what they needed to go over. And then the assessments that were effective were the benchmark. And then knowing when they would grade their homework and they got a good grade, they'd get really excited and be like, okay, I really understood this. So that's how the assessments were effective in his class, knowing if they got questions right and knowing if they got improved. So the data was used for what they needed to review and go over. So the definition of classroom management would have to be how your classroom's run and how the classroom is run and how you run your classroom. That is my definition of classroom management. So what rules and procedures did I see in his classroom? In the picture, I included his expectations, and they say be respectful, be prepared, and do your best. And most of the time his students were respectful. If they weren't, they got their name written on the board and then a tally mark, and either that was points off their daily grade or how many laps they were going to run, with him being a coach, and then or they got sent in the hall. So when being prepared, most of his students were prepared, and then there was a few that were never prepared for his class, that never brought their homework back, or never did their homework. So some students weren't prepared, but most of the time they were. And then all his students always were doing their best no matter what. Like, they always gave 100% whether they were struggling or not. They always did their best. So what is the difference between rules and procedures? So rules is something they follow versus procedures is something they do. What consequences did I witness? They would either get in the hall, they would have to go to the hall if they didn't do their homework, if they were disruptful, misbehaving, or they got their name and tally marks put, which is how many points or how many laps they're going to run. And what makes a class well managed, I think, it's not letting your students have free time, but if they do finish their work, at least have them do an activity that you would want, like a math activity that you would want, like regardless they'd still be doing something you want, whether it be a color by number or something like that, like they would still be doing something that you want them to practice and work on. What makes a class well managed, so that's what I would do, is like really not have free time and constantly just have a routine and like be on them. So were students on task? Why and why not? So most of the time students were on task, but there were times when students weren't on task, and they weren't on task because they were honestly bored. The students didn't want to be taking notes from a workbook. They would rather be doing something fun. So when I did my micro teach, the students loved taking notes like through a foldable, and then they loved taking their own versions of the notes instead of just copying something from their workbook. I was like, I told them these notes were what best benefited them, and so that was something that they enjoyed, and they were on task the entire time. So I wanted to go back to rules and procedures right up here. So a rule that Coach Reynolds has was like be respectful, versus a procedure that he has is they have to wait outside his classroom before they can go in, as well as waiting before they can be dismissed. And then he also has procedures on when they go and get paper, when they sharpen their pencil, and all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to go and tell you what are some rules and procedures that he has. So what have I learned and what I would and wouldn't utilize in my classroom? So what I would utilize in my classroom is this calendar view that he has for all his classrooms. I would definitely have if I taught multiple subjects or grades, I would have each grade in a different color, when the 6th grade ends, when assignments are due, just so that they would know what's coming up. Also, I would utilize right here, if I can, right here is each grade, their objective, and what they're going to learn. I would also add focus questions and guiding questions as well. So I would utilize that in my classroom. What I wouldn't utilize in my classroom is the group desks. That did not work. I think there's fun ways to incorporate rows in your classroom, and that's what I would try to do in my classroom versus not using grouping desks up. I think the only time they need to be in groups is if they're working in a group. So what is the important lessons that I've learned in my placement? To be flexible and to really just go with the flow, and to have activities and a backup plan if something goes wrong. I also think what's the most effective teaching technique would have to be teaching from the board, creating a fun teaching style, whether it be in notes that they take, foldables, activities, games. That's the most effective techniques I think would be great for a classroom. What were the most ineffective teaching techniques I witnessed were sitting from his desk, teaching out of a textbook, teaching out of a workbook, just going with what they said, as well as just, there were times where he taught from a dot cam. I think the dot cam could be used on how to do a step-by-step if you didn't want to do the boards, but have the students follow with you. So what I want to consider in my future classroom is I want to consider all the types of learning styles my students may have, as well as which students go well sitting with one another, and what types of note-taking I can better incorporate in my classroom. So that's what I've learned, and I had a great semester. at Morgan Mill ISD with Coach Reynolds. So that's my final project.